May 3rd was declared World Press Freedom Day by the UNESCO.
Public good is not going to the public, but still it's there somewhere with the media.
Is that in Sri Lanka, when you talk about gossip, you're not talking about celebrity gossip, you're actually talking about political gossip.
There is a place where they could come to if they have issues with newspapers.
Should we also always just get triggered by everything that goes on in social media? First, let's talk about gatekeepers themselves in the news media. Can they abuse their position?
The people who are behind this online media, they don't see the consequences what they write or what they post.
Around COVID especially, we see these people are just, it's disaster fatigue now. Do you think it is time that the media as an industry takes back the news? Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Debrief, brought to you by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom on World Press Freedom Day. I'd like to begin by introducing our panel that we've invited here today. To my left is Mr. Sukumar Rockwood, who is the CEO of the Sri Lanka Press Complaints Commission. To his left is Udita Jayasinghe, who is the Deputy Editor of the Daily FT. And to her left is Shiha Anis, a very senior journalist who is the head of training at the Center for Investigative Journalism. Thank you everyone for joining us. Before I begin though, I would like to tell our audience a little bit about World Press Freedom Day. May 3rd was declared World Press Freedom Day by the UNESCO to remind governments of their commitment to honor press freedom and respect press freedom as per the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Sri Lanka is a signatory of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 14 of our Constitution also ensures us the freedom of expression, but as we know, there are some restrictions to this. Be that as it may, the theme for this year's World Press Freedom Day is information as public good, and that is what we're here to discuss today. To start off, I'd like to turn the question to Shiha and ask you, Shiha, as a senior journalist and now a trainer, when you look at the media industry from an outside point of view, do you think the media professionals and the media we create, the content that we create, is in the public good?
I think you have to look at it in two ways. So, yes and no. Yes, because once you create an information or once you report something, it's there and it's in the public domain, right? So anybody can access it. But there are information that you gather, but still you cannot put it to the public domain, right? There are some, it may be because of controversies or because you don't have the response from the other side, right? When you try to do media reporting, you always say you need to be objective, right? Now what we see here in Sri Lanka is the media are most concerned about being fair and balanced, right? And we don't see that objective, right? So because of that, we don't see the real truth in the public domain, whereas media as a whole, they know what's happening, right? So in that sense, that public good is not going to the public, but still it's there somewhere with the media.
Right, so you're saying in essence, because of trying to hold on to certain bits of information for whatever reasons, this information is sometimes not getting out, and it's within and we know this. We know that we know a lot of information within ourselves that the public doesn't know. And I think very often we see on social media people taking the entire wrong side of the story, and we don't even get involved and say, no, actually this is the real story, because we're trying to build our own article or story or whatever. So I understand what you mean. Udita, first I'll just ask you, what's your take on that as well? Do you have an opinion on whether you think information that we create for people is in the public good, do you think?
I think by and large, yes, but I think it's also a case where
because there is so much diversity out there, I think there is also this need to build trust, build accountability, build relationships, and there is a question whether that process is happening. So I think when you take the large ecosystem, there is much need to address the concerns in this space and perhaps fine-tune what is happening so that it does serve public interest in a more consistent and reliable way. Yes.
Right.
So just to, I just want to add to that. As a journalist, you know that one of the principal things we're taught as young journalists is that we should, everything that we do make, everything we do in fact is for the public interest, that we should always have the public interest in mind. And Shiha, you will agree because you teach media ethics, and that is something that I know you teach, that when we are deciding on a story or when you're deciding whether to publish something or not, we have to first ask ourselves, is this in the public interest? So do you think that when we look at a lot of the stuff that comes out on websites that are just gossip, we all know that the top sites in Sri Lanka are gossip sites. What does this tell us of the consumerism even when it comes to media in Sri Lanka? Would either of you like to?
What is very interesting to me is, it's interesting that you touched on the gossip sites, because this has been observed before, is that in Sri Lanka when you talk about gossip, you're not talking about celebrity gossip, you're actually talking about political gossip, right?
Correct.
So there's definitely this consuming interest in politics and the various, machinations and impacts that it has. And that I think is really fascinating for a small country to be this obsessed with politics. It's quite interesting. But in terms of public interest, if you go back to that question, public interest, yes, we are taught to function in terms of public interest, but unfortunately there is a business side to our industry, and that means engagement, that means getting eyeballs, that means getting revenue, and these things don't always align, right? So public interest plus the revenue side of things don't always align. So the struggle is always to find a way where you're landing on public interest, but with a facet that also covers this very real issue of sustainability and just, being a profitable media business, because unfortunately that is what we're supposed to be. This is a business and what we're creating is a product.
Correct.
So you have to create the product with public interest in mind, but you also have to be able to sell that product and still be able to, so this is a cycle, right? We're not machine gunning public interest to the public hoping that some of it is going to stick. It has to be, so this ecosystem needs to be completed, and that is very much where the consumer, the reader, the viewer, the doomsday scroller, whoever you call them, they are all involved in this cycle, and managing this cycle is really what public interest is now about. I don't think it is any more limited to just the media. I think that traditional concept of only the journalist should focus on public interest is an outdated model, right? Because technology has advanced to such an extent, and we're no longer an island from a metaphorical or a physical sense, right? We are now interconnected. There's so much happening. There's so many advancements in technology. It is impacting us in unforeseeable, unpredictable ways. So now we need to adapt, and this idea of public interest must also evolve alongside these same ideals, and we need to make it achievable at a very practical level.
Right. Thank you for that.
Public interest not to the extent of the freedom of the wild ass.
Yes, but that again is a whole debate on where that we land up on that.
There should be ethics also involved in that.
I think, ethics and as well as the business side, as Udita correctly said, public interest alone will not ensure the sustainability of media business, right? So the human nature is as such that people would like gossip, right? So they want gossip, right? But whereas when you try to give them the information they need, which is in public interest, they might not be interested. So as media, as journalists, it's your duty to balance it, right? To ensure the sustainability as well as to give the public interest news.
Correct. So we're not parenting the public.
Yes, exactly, and not this ivory tower ideal of, we are just journalists.
We get to be the arbitrators.
Yeah, there has to be a conversation with the other side, with the other stakeholders. They are very much part of what we're doing, and so and also look, I may not think that a certain topic is of public interest, but I may be wrong about that, right?
Yeah.
We as individuals, I think, make a very big mistake when we sort of try to dictate and sort of put a fence around what we consider to be public interest.
And because of online technologies now, we have that feedback. We
Exactly.
can tell what
That's
people
right.
want.
Exactly, and that's huge. I think journalists should absolutely engage in that. Where I think is a bit of a grey area for me is, should you put yourself in the place of what public interest occupies? So how much of what you report should be about yourself? Should you put yourself in this?
Or your
is
interests,
that what
yeah.
is? Yeah. Is that so? Because as traditional journalists, as you know, and all of us know, you're supposed to take yourself out of the story.
Correct.
And increasingly, these new technologies are putting us in the center of the story, and that I debate about.
Yeah,
a lot.
journalism itself and media is changing because we are trying to evolve to new demands, especially how technology has affected society, and now we're trying to figure out how do we fit in here.
Yeah.
Mr. Rockwood, you are the senior most member on this panel. I think your experience would span all of us put together, and we're very grateful to have you here. What I'd like to know, and I know you've said this before publicly, and this is being echoed by a lot of people, perhaps mostly in the administration itself, in government, that it's not possible to regulate the online space. What can you explain that?
It is difficult to regulate the online newspapers or at least on online media, but I could speak more so for the print because I am with the print media, and we have the editor's code of professional practice by which all journalists are supposed to adhere to, and I think that basically is also common for the electronic media as well.
Yes.
Because there are lots of instances where there is a common line going through between the electronic media code as well as the print media code. So regulation, I would not propose regulation. Self-regulation is what we need with this code of professional practice to self-regulate the media, the print media,
Right.
and also it could be done for the electronic media as well.
So do you think self-regulation has worked? Because now the Press Complaints Commission is a tool of self-regulation, but has it worked effectively even with the print?
Self-regulation has worked to a certain degree in the print media, and there are lots of instances where we could show where self-regulation has been very successful in the print media, because editors are now more and more becoming very responsive, and before the complaint comes to the PCCSL, the complaint goes to the editor, and he in fact looks at it in a very positive way and immediately carries the right of readers.
Okay.
So that is something which I have seen, which has been improving on a daily basis, where editors are getting more and more responsive to carrying the corrections
Clarifications, right.
before it comes to us.
Just to explain to our audience, Mr. Rockwood, can you tell me what the Sri Lanka Press Complaints Commission does?
Well, the Sri Lanka Press Complaints Commission of Sri Lanka was set up after an international symposium held way back in 1998, where there were some of the international media also was involved in this, and the need was to set up a self-regulatory body, and so the Press Complaints Commission of Sri Lanka was set up as a self-regulatory body, and we have the editor's code of professional practice which the PCCSL takes around to newsrooms and talks to journalists and also to civil society, that there is a place where they could come to if they have issues with newspapers, print media, and we would then take it up directly with the editors concerned if there are violations in the editor's code, and then the editor, if he agrees, he carries the correction, which is the first step, which is conciliation, and then it goes on from there. If the editor doesn't doesn't comply, we would then go on to the Dispute Resolution Council, which is headed by former Secretary General of Parliament, Mr. Nihasani Viratna, and in that body of 11 we have five journalists and 6 non-journalists who are members, and the chairman is also an attorney at law. So we go to that body and then we seek their assistance to talk to the editors concerned and the complainant and bring about amicable solution to the issue.
Right. Now, this would work in the case in which there is a physical newsroom and newsrooms that we can recognize. But when we move into the online fora, many of us know that there are news websites that are set up without physical spaces. Many times we don't know who the editors are, we don't know who is behind any of these things. What do both of you all think in terms of is self-regulation going to be enough when we're talking about the online space? Shriha?
No, I think for me, self-regulation has not been effective in online media, because the online media is not only by the journalist, right? It's also by the citizen,
Correct.
right? So it's called sometimes netizen, right? So I don't think it's effectively self-regulated in terms of online journalism, especially when it comes to Twitter, Facebook, and some of the other social media network. So the issue here is the credibility, right? So if you want to maintain a social media presence or a social media network, in under your name or under a registered name, then the credibility matters. So they will try to follow this self regulation to make sure that their credibility is sustained or preserved. However, we also see, like earlier we said, like about the balance between the public interest and then the marketing, right? So we also see this sensationalization, right, time to time, right? So sometimes this the people who are behind this online media, they don't see the consequences what they write or what they post in this social media, right? The moment they realize, it's too late, because it's not like somebody reading in a paper and then reacting, right? It's instant reaction, right? So if you post something that you have not verified, you are going to see the consequence, but then later you will find that it's not the truth, right? But by the time you say this is, by the time you are trying to correct that news or correct that information, everything is over, right? This has happened again and again for the last 2-3 years in several incidences.
Yeah.
So there should be some guidelines. I'm not saying that regulation or law, but there should be some guidelines so that everybody embrace that guidelines and work accordingly.
So there is the code of professional practice which print media journalists adhere to.
Something
so
like
something
that.
We
But
could
the only
have
thing is you cannot basically kind of convince
force
everybody to
it
kind
down
of
them.
adapt it.
If I may add to that, what I really think is what everyone is sort of saying is you need to incentivize these online platforms to adapt ethics and proper behavior, if we come to that, and incentivizing them is a big challenge, right? So we need to have a multi-pronged approach for this. I don't think we can have this one solution suits all situations. So one thing that I've been quite fascinated with is that when it comes to online platforms, one thing they do need in order to get access to government information, etc., is that they need to register with the Government Information Department, right? So there is already a database of many of these online publications in existence. The problem is nothing is being done with them, and the danger is that that can then be used by the government, because they can always use the excuse that, this is not happening ethically, there is great social damage, and therefore we need to move in and regulate this space. So before that happens, I think it's really in the interests of these organizations or individuals to come together by themselves, because this is how the press freedom self-regulation came out, because before the government could step in, the newspapers decided, no, we need to step up and do something about this. And so they were very proactive. So I think A, we needed to be proactive, B, we needed to be diverse, 3, we need to make it incentivized, and that includes increasing media literacy in this country, right? So if you are consuming information regularly from a website or another kind of forum or platform, please go and see, look, what are the ethics that these people follow? Do they have a section where they list out their principles and their policies and their sort of standards that they apply to? Do they frequently frequently leech off other organizations and just sort of take their stories and pass them off and saying so and so said or so and so reported, or are they actually going and doing their own reporting, and is this credible, you know? So there is a whole, as I said before, it's now really evolved into a partnership. Where people need to also be involved in this process, and then I think a lot of these publications will be incentivized to move towards this sort of guidelines and platforms, or some kind of self-regulatory mechanism, which of course needs to be updated regularly because technology is changing so much, so fast, that really having a codified system is, you know, it's not enough anymore.
Because now, like for instance, the editor's code, every 2 years it is reviewed, and we call for public suggestions, we call for journalists and from the academia also.
But
and
I think what makes it easier, Mr. Rockwood, is that when it comes to press, these are again, like I said, physical places that have registered, that are known, that you have relationships with. But my bigger problem with the online space is, even when you were speaking, Udita, about about the online space themselves wanting to come together and do this, but there are many websites that sort of have agendas, and they're the ones, correct, even to register, because they're the ones bringing in the fake news, they're the ones bringing in the political news, they're the ones bringing in the stuff that people want to hear. So
so it's really a very complex thing, right? Because on one hand we have freedom of expression, which no one really wants to mess with, and then on the other hand we have technology and this very swift development of technology, and then of course you have public interest, conventional media, etc., etc. So it's a really complex space. And honestly, if you look around the world, this is a challenge that all governments everywhere in the world is tackling, right? So it's really a process of evolution. It's a process of learning and growing and collaborating together. And I think the more than looking at the eventual end result, I think what is more important is getting involved and being proactive now in whatever little way you can in order to address this issue, and just grow with that process. Because I mean, I too agree with you. I don't think we have sort of set solutions for this now.
And I think what you said is interesting and important for even our viewers to know, that this is not something that is unique only to Sri Lanka. All over the world, governments and media are fighting to define this space, fighting to maintain the freedom of expression while ensuring other people's freedoms are not infringed on. Shiha, I'd like to take you back to back to press again, to the topic of gatekeepers. As we in the media know, but perhaps our audience doesn't know, gatekeepers are traditionally the editors or sub-editors, mostly editors and deputy editors, I would say, who decide what is going to be printed in the news and what is not. With the advent of the internet and with social media, it became known that this era of gatekeepers is no longer applicable, that gatekeepers were no longer important. At the same time, recently there's now been articles on the return of the gatekeepers, because you need gatekeepers to come and help with this free flow of information that is now drowning people that are on social media. What do you think about the gatekeepers? First, let's talk about gatekeepers themselves in the news media. Can they abuse their position?
Gatekeeping is a very important process in the media, and gatekeepers, as you said, like a senior editor or senior journalist who basically decide, okay, this is what we have to inform and this is what we have to filter, right? Now there is a huge competition with the invent of this online media, right? Now you want to kind of filter something, and when you report that, people will basically not want to read your news because they already know everything about the news because of online media, right? Everything is reported everywhere, right? So this gatekeeper position needs to think in a strategic way now, right? It's not about unlike earlier, like, okay, we can't report this, right? Because everything is there online,
already out there,
right? So people will tweet, those who are involved with the incident will tweet, right? So about I'm just taking an example about an incident, right? So when you report it, you people won't find it very attractive or sensational news, because you do have not reported the core issues there, which has been reported already by several online media, right? So I'm not saying that they have to incorporate everything whatever they know, but follow the ethics, right? We have this ethical guideline, right? So follow the ethical guideline, right? And do your maximum to report and inform the public. And then you asked about abusing the gatekeeper position, right? So I would suggest that it all depends on how you have molded in terms of your ethics, right? How you have how you are confident about your media ethics and how you are using it, right? So in practical way, what we have seen in Sri Lanka is like sometimes it all depends on the ownership, right? So ownership decides, okay, this is what you have to report and this is what you don't have to report. So the gatekeeper, so-called gatekeeper, will have to satisfy the ownership, unfortunately.
And this is a big issue in Sri Lanka, especially because we have such a small market, and ownership is very clear. We know who owns and what the agenda is, and those are big issues that we have had to deal with. Udita, do you think it's about value addition then, if the news is already out there?
So just to add to what Shihar was saying, I absolutely agree with him, but I think there are two things that gatekeepers are now tackling, which has really thrown us massive curveballs. One is the fact that we live in what academics refer to as a post-truth environment, right? The truth no longer matters. You can say whatever you want, you can lie as much as possible to your constituents, to your stakeholders, and there are no repercussions, right? There was an era a long time ago when politicians, if they lied, at a future election or whatever, there would be consequences to their lies. Now there's no such thing. They can say as many untruths. I think, President Trump, former President Trump, has been a fantastic example of that, where his Coke boat base will follow him no matter what, right? And we see reflections and manifestations of that in other parts of the world as well, right? So does truth really even matter anymore, right? And how do gatekeepers deal with this challenge? To me, that is a massive, massive point that we should have lots of conversations on. The second thing is, of course, I come back to this issue of confirmation bias, which is in the olden days, like, nearly 20 years ago when I entered media, we reported according to all of these sort of ideals, and then people sort of consumed the information, and that was the process. But now you have the audience also coming to the news with a set of bias. So we have this situation where, for example, you and I may have different views, but we will walk away from a conversation more convinced of our different views, as opposed to building bridges, which was the role of media before.
So it's just like building a subscriber base for something. And then catering for that.
Exactly. And so you see this huge polarization of media organizations elsewhere in the world. I think it's most clearly seen in the US, but it is seen elsewhere as well, right? So in order to there is no longer this sort of universal ideal. It's a case of, these are my political ideals, this is the readership that conforms to my political ideals, and I cater to them, right? Everyone else kind of gets ignored or is irrelevant, right? So these are huge challenges for gatekeepers. So then who are we gatekeeping for? Why are we gatekeeping for? What are we gatekeeping really at the end of the day, So these are conversations I have in my head all the time. And it's really a fascinating evolution of our industry. And again, we are still grappling with these challenges on a daily basis.
Mr. Rockwood, coming as you do from a press background, as you heard Udita and Shiha both explain the democratization of information, moving from spaces that they were held and controlled by gatekeepers into a sort of free flow of information on the online space, and now, as Udita was explaining, the fragmentation of news, of information. Do you think that this democratization of information was a good thing, is a good thing?
Well, we always say there's always two sides to a story. So it is always right in that instance that we have all aspects to a story. For instance, you need the official aspect, which is very important if it's a criminal act or something like that, and then you need the quotes coming in if it is a quotes story. You need even if it's a parliament copy, it has to have that proper input from the correct reportage of what was transpired in parliament. So, but what happens is the journalists sometimes could, depending on their backgrounds of course and the educational qualifications, their values and ethical standards, they could sort of become part and participle of that whole story, and then they could bring in their opinions, and that is something that journalists should not do, bring in their opinions. They should just report objectively and report with ethics in mind. The sensitivity of a story or a photograph that is published, for instance, like in suicides, you don't publish photographs of people hanging from trees or dead bodies as such, because those are pictures that should not go in a newspaper, because the editor's code says so, and it is also sensitivity, and there is privacy of the family involved, the shock and the realization of the fact that one member of the family has died because of suicide is a big shock. So when you go to have this photograph coming in also in the newspapers, it is disturbing. So that is why the code probably would advise and mold prospective journalists to write in a very responsible way, socially responsible, so that what goes out there in the media and in the public eye is something that is ethical and it has some sort of values in it.
Right.
But what happens today is it doesn't happen like that. In some instances, they over sensationalize stories, and as a result, it creates a lot of hurt for the people's concerned.
Right. So what you're saying in essence is this kind of ethical journalism is being overtaken by this online fora that
That's
is
what,
running
yes,
at breakneck
yes,
speed.
because for instance, if there is an accident involving a bus having knocked down two people on a motorbike, the social media will probably pick it up and put it up there straight away. But then the print media must be more mature enough not to carry pictures of the dead body on the road, or they could, you know, be a bit more mature in the sense that once it goes into print, it's there, you can always see it.
Right.
And it also does, as I said, disturbing for the relations and the friends and the people concerned.
So do you think, Mr. Rockwood, that there is a place for print media even today when people
Yes,
say print media is dying?
very much there, because we still believe the printed word.
Right.
And especially in our society, it just flashes by, the image on the TV and in the radio, it just flashes past. Sometimes you might miss out on some of the words. So you always have to reflect back on the newspaper, because that's the printed word, and that is always the main point.
A lot of work also has gone into it. Udita, I wanted to talk to you about a recent example. There was a video that went viral, I don't know if you noticed, a woman and another woman beating an older gentleman. So obviously there was a lot of outcry on social media and people were very angry with these women. And I remember at one point I was talking to my team, and of course I was outraged at first, and I was like, this is terrible, what is happening to our country. And then I thought it was a good example to tell the team, listen, we don't know the story. What if he had been sexually abusing someone, or they had found him doing something? What if that was the reaction there, which none of us thought about, because we were just reacting to what we saw, which was the two women beating this guy up. Do you think that this is what happens to social media often, where we react so quickly to what we see without stopping to take the time to actually find out what the real story is? I'm not saying it's either or, it could have very well been what we saw, but the place of a journalist is to make sure we take those small steady steps into finding the right story and taking it out in print. Do you think that's what we should be doing, and do you think the public should know that they need to wait for the real story to come out 3 days later, 4 days later if necessary, a week later in the Sunday papers, but that's when you're going to get your real story?
Wow, that's a tough one. Okay, so I think that primarily media is an industry that has to move with the people, right? So I think our job, and this is why what I discussed earlier, confirmation bias and post-truth politics is creating such a huge challenge, because on top of revenue challenges, you see this polarization of media. I think media needs to occupy the middle space. So absolutely, in that sense, and also I'd like to pose this interesting question: should we really conventional media or mainstream media or newspapers, TV, you name it, should we also always just get triggered by everything that goes on in social media?
Correct.
Is our role not defining what matters to our readership and then catering to that? Do we need to always leap on the latest thing that is there, right? So in my sense, because we also have these very practical resource constraints, like I don't have 50 reporters to allocate to every single thing that goes viral, you know, I don't have that. So for me, I think that's where sort of the gatekeeping role comes into play, where you take a step back and you ask yourself, okay, is this really what is needed today? Maybe it is, I don't know, I'm just saying, right? And whether we can expend the kind of resources that is needed to really, really look into this story. And can we do it in a timely manner? Because as you observed, 4 days down the line, it's not really going to matter, right? So we need an instant, or do you have, say someone has seen the video, already gone and lodged a complaint with the police are taking it up, they are going with this, and so do we then just go to the police and say, okay, give us the idea, you know, give us the, you know, details of what is going on, we do a story around that, and then we follow it on from a day-to-day basis and we make sure that the public are informed. But look, there is a law enforcement you know, system in this country. There are other ways to deal with it. Perhaps there is a senior elders home or a senior person who has come forward and has offered to look after this person. Maybe that person has been hospitalized. If that issue is being addressed by other stakeholders, is it really necessary for media to get involved? Right? That would be my point one. And point two, are there, as you say, yes, absolutely we need to look at larger issues. Maybe this is happening because we have aging population in this country and we don't have the resources, we don't have the healthcare services, we don't have social welfare support as we should be having for our senior citizens. Maybe that is, yes, so maybe there's a bigger story here that we should be looking at, and that's our job, to identify that story and write about that. Right, and to encourage policymakers to pay attention to that. I mean, look, you know, for example, there is this whole issue where overall suicide rates in Sri Lanka are going down, but suicide rates among our senior citizens are increasing. So, you know, maybe that's the story, right? Maybe this incident is something that is connected. So I think we always need to go above and beyond, absolutely. But we also need to decide where we land on this topic and whether we are also going to be sort of trigger happy response to social media. I don't agree with that. I think it's totally fine. I mean, I have reporters who come to me and they're like, oh, you know, this is happening on Twitter, and I'm like, let Twitter handle it. This is not, this is not my, exactly, not really, Mr. Super, but I think that there needs to be a collaboration. But again, I think we can decide the contours of how we react to something and why we react to it, and what is the most productive way to react to it.
Right.
It doesn't always have to be this, you know, quick take, 200 words, what is, you know, that I think for people who are career journalists, I think that's not what we're supposed to be doing. I think we need to take a step back and sort of look at this from a very holistic perspective and address the public concerns, but do so with nuance, with depth, with information, with inclusivity. And I think there is a market for that. Like for example, the publication that I work for, we have very small presence on social media and Twitter. And you know what is very interesting is that that has not affected our readership at all, because our readership, at least in my head, I hope this is true, we cater to people who want more substantive, substantial, in-depth, nuanced information. That is
I
the
think identifying the audience is
exactly.
also very important, because
and
if
these
you're
are
mature,
the people that we are catering to, and we encourage other people to join us by all
generally
means. Please
the
do.
print media in this country is more, I think, looked
And
at by the mature
where,
audiences.
So this is where we also need to remain relevant, right? Because newspapers, as you say, is a dying art. But I would say where we need to work is we need to, and this is not just limited to newspapers, this is, you know, I think covering all forms of media. We need to evolve with what the public needs from us. And sometimes the public may not even know what they need from us, but we still need to figure it out.
Well, I would express 2 points here. One is, you know, the incident, the example you gave us. Like now, with that kind of incident, now there is a new opportunity, like verification. Right now, every news media is talking about this verification tools, verification desk, right? So
Fact
they want
checking.
fact checking,
fact
right?
checking.
Basically,
Very
it's about
important,
fact checking,
yes.
right? So
Get your sources correct.
that's right. I mean, if you can verify that, right? say if there's an incident, and if you can verify what actually has happened, that's
that
it's
is
a real
much very
public
important,
service.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That is
And
very
it can be just, okay, look, if this thing actually is sort of reported, say maybe TV is a better medium to verify it and put it out there.
That's one thing.
Right? So why do we then do
Need to jump
newspapers
in.
and everyone else need to wade into this?
Right.
Is that really
Yeah.
necessary?
So everybody is going after the same
Exactly,
story.
and it's a
Yeah.
huge waste of resources because you're just duplicating the same
Yeah.
thing, and that makes no sense at all.
Second point, I think Udita also raised this. Now, most of us in Sri Lanka, we are used to this incidents-based reporting, right? We don't take a step back and see the big picture of why it's happening.
Yes.
We just only report, what happened there, and we don't see why it has happened, what was the bigger picture, and what's the policy response for that.
And the larger
That's
trends.
where,
Yeah.
that's
And this also
that's where we
triggers
need
so
to
much
report. I think
fatigue.
we
Yeah,
need
That
exactly.
is where I
And-
think newspapers can come.
And
Yeah.
also where
Because they have the
this is
space.
also resulting in a situation where the audience is just fatigued. I mean, around COVID especially, we see these people are just, it's disaster fatigue now,
Yeah.
right?
That's why I wanted to bring this question in actually to ask you, Sheha. Do you think it is time that the media as an industry takes back the news? I'm going to add a hashtag there. Hashtag take back the news. Do you think it's time that we stop responding to breaking news, that we stop breaking news, perhaps give the breaking news people the chance to do breaking news, and maybe
No, I
the
think-
rest of the industry starts taking back the stories, start telling the people what they need to know as opposed to what is happening?
Yeah, I think those are two different things. Breaking news and the in-depth news, those are two different things. Now, you cannot compete with online media, right?
Yeah.
Traditional media cannot compete. Even sometimes TVs cannot compete with online media, with Twitter and Facebook, right? So they should know their contours, their role in the media, right? And they should refine them, right? And what people expect is more in-depth reporting, right? Now, one of the themes this year is the financial viability of
Yes.
media,
Yes.
right? We have never thought of it so far, right? But there is a financial viability if you give the credible, in-depth, accurate news,
Yeah.
right? I don't think we are aware of it, and we have not focused on that so far,
Correct.
right? We are just competing with others
Yes.
and trying to overdo things than
Correct.
the others,
Correct.
right? But there is a huge market for accurate, in-depth, policy-based news.
Credible
Right.
news, right?
So I think we
Good.
need to focus on that.
In-depth analytical.
That's right. And
Balanced
people,
news.
people would love to know, rather than what happened, what's going to happen. What does this mean?
Correct.
How is going to have an impact on me? How is it going to have an impact on our overall society? Right? These are the questions you have to answer.
Right.
Right? On a policy basis, you need to kind of argue and assess and analyze.
Right.
Right? This is what not happening in Sri Lanka.
It's like a value added to the story.
That's
value
correct.
add
And
this
also
to-
the two don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? You
Yeah.
can report the news, but then you can also have a more in-depth, more substantive analysis of that. So I don't really see why we need to pick between the two. I think the readers need to pick between the two,
What they want, yes.
right?
Right.
And the audience and the consumers of media, because that's essentially what they are, they need to decide, what am I really, I have a limited amount of time. We're all part of the attention economy. And I have a lot to say about the attention economy, which shall not be repeated here. But basically, it's the same challenge all of us face. We have a limited amount of attention, and we need to decide how best we can use that limited amount of space and time that we have. So then, if you have institutions or publications that are really trying to give you the best value for that attention, I think that is worth it.
Yeah.
And this is how many other global organizations, global media houses are managing this challenge by adding value and doing it across the entire spectrum of their product, right? It's not just in newspapers. I think that's a really archaic and sort of very siloed approach. It's newspapers, it's websites, it can be Twitter, it can be even TikTok. BBC is doing massive work on TikTok, right? So it can be on any medium. That doesn't, I think that's really irrelevant. It's more like what you bring to the table,
Correct, yeah.
rather than, what is it? I think we get sort of bogged down in the details rather than sort of seeing this big picture and just
yeah.
catering to that.
Yeah. I think this anyway, this discussion has served as such an eye-opener for people within the industry, even more than I think an audience from outside. A few more questions before I wrap up. Shiha, one of the other topics highlighted by UNESCO this year is something known as enhanced media and information literacy, which is basically asking if people recognize and value journalism as a public good. Short answer, do you think that happens?
That happens very slowly in Sri Lanka because the media literacy part of our citizen is very low, right? They can't verify something very quickly, right? So, for instance, like in the first decade of this century, if you want to know accurate news, you have to go through all the newspapers, all the TV news, and then decide, okay, this is what the truth is.
But the two pictures,
right? But you can't expect people to do that, right? I mean, if you are in the news, you will do that. Or if you are really kind of, you know something and you want something, you will do that. But people can't do that, right? Now, that's where we need to kind of enhance the media literacy of the people and try to give more information about, okay, this is how you can, know more information about this news, right? Or they can go for a rating system, right? In Sri Lanka, I don't agree with the rating system of this news channel, but they can go for a rating channel based on the credibility,
Correct, yes.
right? And then you can kind of come up and say, okay, this is the best news in terms of accuracy, credibility, right, and trustworthiness, right? Something like that, some scorecards, right? And then ask the people to kind of follow it, right? Then there will be changes, and also at the same time, people who are involved with this, promoting the media, they should work on this media literacy among the public.
Yes, because another thing I noticed is this new verification thing, the verification of news. I find that a lot of people are now going to the verification sites and the verification WhatsApp groups rather than even following the news.
Exactly.
Because the news comes anyway on your phone as alerts, but you don't know if the news is right or not. So you just go to the verification to know if the news is right or not, and that's actually an indictment on our media culture here, because it's got to the stage that we're now looking only for the verification,
the correct picture,
story, because we don't even know what's actually going on. And what it breeds is ignorance, and when it breeds ignorance, we know very well that we can't function as a democracy because we don't know what's going on, or we're so, even if we know, we're so just out of tune and we don't care anymore, or we become apathetic, so we can't move forward. Mr. Rockwood, the Press Council Code of Ethics that you were... No, I was talking about the Code of Ethics that we were talking about before in 1981 that came for the journalists. Do you think enough young journalists and media people know about even this Code of
No, there is an issue because lots of young journalists are just moving through. Some join in soon after the advanced level, and then when they get admission to university or they get better jobs, or while on the run as a journalist, they move on. And so then what happens is the newer journalists that come in probably will not have enough openness to the editor's code. So what I suggested was, and I tried talking to editors and senior desk heads also, and telling them that they must also educate the gatekeepers, the sub-editors, and also the reporters. And most editors, as far as I know, do that. But then somewhere down the line, some young journalists do skip the whole purpose and the value of ethics. And then when some story goes in the newspapers, that is where you see that they have done something wrong, they violated the editor's code, and then the newspaper has to correct itself. But then once we bring it to their notice that certain things have violated the editor's code, then of course certainly editors do call up the journalists and talk to them, and then it is corrected, so it will not be repeated again.
Shiha is head of training of the Center for Investigative Journalism, and that is, in my opinion at least, the primary training center for journalists in Sri Lanka currently. Do you think journalists receive enough training?
No. I think in my perception, there are two professions in Sri Lanka anybody can do, even without an O-level. That is, one is journalism, other one is politics.
Yes.
I'm sorry to say this, but it's true, right? So, with that background, if a journalist comes, it's very hard to kind of give the training. Right now, you don't need a minimum standard for a journalist, right? If you take a country like Philippines or even India, they need a minimum degree for a journalist, right, to become a journalist, or at least a diploma. Like, we don't need that, right? I mean, you just need a head, right, to go to a press conference and bring the press release and just write, right? And we have this culture of voice cut journalism, right? We do news based on the voice cuts. We don't verify things. We don't do our research. We don't go for fact checking. We don't give enough information and background of a news, right? So based on that, we have a culture of this voice cut journalism and quick news, right? So I think if you can train the journalists, right, and we have been involved in mid-career journalist training, and we actually found, like, I mean, we were asking ourselves, like, how these people have been there in the industry for 10 years, right? So there's a huge gap between what they are now and what their professional level is, right? So if the institutions, the media institutions, can ensure more and more training for these people, right, based on ethics, based on what the niche market they are following, I think it's really good to have that kind of training to get more efficient as well as kind of academic journalists in this country.
Right. So my final question to all the panelists, and I think Shiha, if you haven't covered it in your answer already, you can take it again, would be, what do you think needs to be done to develop a free, independent and pluralist press in Sri Lanka?
I think free, independence and pluralistic, this is defined by, in Sri Lanka it's defined by the media owners, right? It's not the same across the board, right? So we need to come up with a common consensus to see, okay, this is what the free, independent and pluralistic media is all about, right? Now we have a media ownership with agenda, right? So everybody has their own agenda. So end of the day, the victims are the people, or the readers. Right? So we need to come to a consensus, how we can have a common goal among all this ownership, and then try to kind of ensure the free, independence and pluralistic society in Sri Lanka.
But maybe what I feel is that the ethics could be the thread running through all media organizations, and if all journalists at different levels will use ethics and ethical reporting, social responsibility, sensitivity, discretion, in their reportage to the general public, and the public by and large should gradually be, I think, educated to change their attitude and not always look out for the violent side of things. Now, instance for now, this COVID deaths that is going on, everybody goes to see how many have died, how many have been PCR tests were done, and how many have been found today. But you should look at the broader picture of it. It's so sad when you go to look at those funeral pictures of the pyres burning out in New Delhi. It's so tragic. So why should certain things happen, and where did we go wrong, and can we correct that attitude, the thinking of the people? And so that is where ethics and values comes in, and then we go back to the education system in the country.
I think we are not promoting enough this free, independence and pluralistic media.
Well, I think it's also the issue where you need to professionalize the industry. That's a huge ask, right? I mean, people are constantly surprised when I say that journalism is not even recognized as a profession in this country. And really, I mean, to add on to what Shihar was saying about media ownership driving agendas, honestly, one of the biggest sort of bulwarks, one of the biggest fighters of those agendas are journalists within those organizations themselves, who are really, working really hard in very challenging environments to ensure that these ethics and this professional aspect of media is brought out. And they need to be supported. I mean, I always, whenever people ask me, my short answer for this question is, train journalists well, pay them well.
Yes.
Because the payment part is not looked at all, and because we don't have a formal industry that is recognized by law, and it is not supported by a framework of laws, we really have this challenge where it's really, you know, what you make of yourself, and that should not be the case. And I think thirdly, there is also a huge role to be played by seniors in the industry, because honestly, a lot of these things are seniors being, you know, not paying the kind of attention they should be paying, not doing the kind of grooming and mentoring and support that they should be giving, and a lot of those issues they need to be sort of bridged and addressed by the seniors themselves, and that is really where professionalism of the industry is really the only solution. Because if you have a system where you know, hold journalists, or you encourage or inspire journalists to hold themselves to a higher standard, and they are in a sense rewarded for that, then I think you may have a solution. But yeah, so that's my thing.
I think standards have to be set.
Right.
You know, you should have basic standards.
Yeah.
Incentivized.
And incentivized standards, because I think we do in newsrooms have certain standards, but I don't know if enough people are incentivized to stick to those standards.
Then
and
also
that
to
is
take on the professional journalists, you should
yeah,
introduce
'cause I
some
mean,
basic
we really,
basic
I mean,
qualification
we have
should
so
be there,
many
basic
promising
training.
people who just end up
Yeah.
leaving the industry after a few years because there are better opportunities elsewhere.
I remember when I was a budding journalist, there were a lot of opportunities for training, right, especially with the Sri Lanka College of Journalism.
Yeah, press
And
institute.
from Scandinavian countries, Scandinavian trainers, I think I participated in more than 10 you know, such workshops, but there is no more, right? And if you see the training, if you offer a training for journalists, the first question they will ask you, okay, how much I'm going to be paid?
Yeah.
We are in such a
And also, I think
sad
there is
situation.
a wealth of journalism still in Sri Lanka.
Of course.
That we can do our own training, right? We have the competence, we have the talent. I don't think we need to. So the issue is just sort of doing this on a sustainable basis and incentivizing people. Because even, I mean, I always go back to this when it comes to the issue of owners. One way to incentivize them is to say, look, if you have credible ethical journalists, your brands are going to be seen as credible and ethical, and you can, you know, that there is a real business proposition behind that. So it's really in your interests to empower your journalists and make sure that they stay in this career sustainably, and so sort of, you know, draw them into the conversation, get them interested. But that is, of course, very challenging to do.
Unless, of course, their interests are otherwise.
Yeah, that's also another
time
problem.
Also, another thing I noticed recently, journalists have lack of knowledge, lack of reading. They don't read their own newspapers sometimes. You're supposed to read your own stories after it is published the next day. So these things must be inculcated in the young journalist, so that he learns, he gives his story and probably is not there when it is gone through the gatekeeper, and when it is eventually published. It's good for him to always check back and see how it has been changed, how it has improved.
May I also just add to that? Because one of the reasons why this happens is because because of this advent of technology, we are working on tighter and tighter news cycles, right? And so unshackling journalists from these deadlines is also a massive task, right? Even for us to sort of take a step back and look at the ecosystem, to look at the landscape and sort of see what is going on is such a huge effort. So really we also need to inculcate better resources. I mean, you know, the psychological toll that it takes on journalists, you know, looking at their welfare. When I say salaries and pays, I'm not just talking about salaries, I'm also talking about, you know, are we treating our journalists the best way we can? Because a lot of people in this industry also just hit burnout. Because they can't anymore, right? I mean, imagine if you're exposed to such a high pressure job day in, day out, 24 hours a day, and there's just no off switch, right? Because the news never sleeps. So what do you do? And I think that is where you have this democratization of media, and in a way that's a good thing, because there are also people who are simply taking, you know, their own sort of definition of media and following that, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. So it is important to have a landscape where people are allowed to do what they believe in. right? That is also important. But at the same time, newsrooms really need to look at, and again, I go back to senior people who really, really need to look at, you know, because when the war was going on, for example, we covered so many disasters, we covered so many tsunamis, we've been to mass grave sites. No one cared whether, you know, this is having some kind of PTSD impact on you. People will just like take a notebook and a pen and just go. So that was it, right? And we have covered like landslides. We have like, I have lost count of the number of disasters I have covered over the decades. And no one cares how you are competing, you know, how are you coping, how are you dealing with this? And those sort of conversations really need to take place inside newsrooms.
I think this conversation has really brought out a lot of things that are lacking in the industry, and that is primarily what I wanted this to be about. I think personally I'm going to start a movement after this. Like I said, hashtag take back the news. We know the slow news is already a trend in some countries, but I think as media professionals we understand that the cycle of news and how fast it is moving with technologies and the way technologies have been adopted to and people are adapting to technologies currently makes it very hard for people to discern between what is actual news, what is newsworthy, what the bigger picture is, what the trends are, what they should actually know, as opposed to what is coming into what is coming on their home pages or what is demanding their attention. So thank you very much, Shiha, Udita and Mr. Rockwood for joining us today. Thank you very much to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for supporting us with this very special segment of Debrief to mark World Press Freedom Day.